are going to learn all about dispute resolution. That's number one. And then number two, we're going to learn about a really interesting program that the Kennewick Police have put together that's called, I believe, I could get corrected on this from the police chief, Ken Holmberg, who's here, but I think it's called Community Cares. We'll learn more about that coming up a little bit later. And let me remind you that we really enjoy adding listeners to our conversation. People can call in and ask questions or make comments, and that phone number, 547-8726. So, first off, we're going to talk about dispute resolution. There is actually a center here in the Tri-Cities, and that's what they do. They're a nonprofit, and they're all about resolving disputes, mediation, basically. So I have Paul Shelp. Is that right, Paul? Do I have the last name correct?
You got it.
Oh, good. All right, Paul is the executive director. We also have Rosemary Valadares, who's here, that she does intake, and she's going to be talking with us as well. Right, Rosemary?
That's right.
Excellent. And then we have Charlene, who's actually had a case that went through the Dispute Resolution Center, so we'll be able to get some inside information about somebody who's actually done it. So, Paul, first of all, how is it that this service even got started in the Tri-Cities?
Well, for a number of years now, there's been a growing movement in the country called alternative dispute resolution. And it's an alternative to litigation and other ways of resolving conflict. And the state of Washington has been really in the lead in many ways on adopting alternative dispute resolution. And so there's 20 centers, dispute resolution centers across the state of Washington. And 16 years ago, the courts here really they were very backed up as far as domestic docket and so forth. Some of the judges and people in the legal community wanted a dispute resolution center here, and then just a number of concerned citizens who knew about this and valued this and wanted it to come to be. So they did all the necessary work to put it together. This was actually, dispute resolution centers was actually brought into law a number of years ago in the revised Code of Washington, where the state authorized dispute resolution centers across the state specifically to help relieve the load of the courts. And so Tri-Cities was one that embraced that 16 years ago. And those citizens worked hard to establish a 501c3 and then to establish relationship with the courts and brought us into being.
16 years ago, so how many, somebody's phone we're tracking down, but how many cases have you done in 16 years?
Oh,
approximately.
Yeah, over 5,000.
5,000, okay. So if I have this image in my mind right, I've got people on one side of the table and other people who have opposing ideas on the other side of the table, and the mediator sitting in the middle trying to talk to those two groups of people. Is that a fair image?
Pretty close. Actually, the mediator's in the middle trying to get the two people on the sides of the table to talk to each other.
To talk to each other,
Yes,
okay.
that's what's very important about our model of mediation, is that our mediators are trained, and they are there to facilitate this mediation process. And we have a model, a process that we use. And they're there to kind of implement that model, guide people through it. But the real point of that model is to get the people who are in dispute or have a conflict to talk to each other about what the issues are, and sometimes what they think the issues are, and what in the process of talking they realize the real issues are two different things.
Mm-hmm.
So we try to get at what are the real issues. The other thing is the mediators are trained to listen carefully, because there's issues, but underlying those issues is underlying interests. And those are the needs that people have. This is the issue, but here's what I really need if this is going to get resolved. And so they listen carefully and try to draw that out, and then they invite the two sides to talk on that level, and basically to negotiate how they. It's a collaborative problem-solving process with the help of the neutral mediators.
Well, that all sounds very very nice. But I'm thinking that the people who have disputes, they're not nice, and I don't mean that they're not nice, but they're very passionate about their position and they want something. So I would think that that might be initially extremely difficult in a setting like that.
Sometimes. It really varies. We do see a lot of people that come into mediation that, by the time they come to mediation, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. So they've been working pretty hard at trying to resolve this, and whatever they're doing isn't working. So this is a whole new approach. It's helping them to sit down in a whole different environment with the help and guidance of a trained mediator, and to communicate on a different level than maybe they've been able to.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, in most conflicts, what gets in the way oftentimes is that there's a lot of emotion involved. And real communication tends to shut down as soon as the emotions begin to soar. And so our mediators are trained to help folks cope with that and begin to communicate on that deeper level of what's really going on here underneath the emotions, and how can we together find a way to resolve this.
Mm-hmm. What kind of cases? What are the predominant types of cases?
Well, what we do more than anything else is related to family, and with the court, it's divorce mediation, it's parenting plan mediation. We do a lot of those that parents are divorcing, or some other circumstance that they're not both going to be able to live with the child, and so the state requires that they submit a parenting plan, which is kind of their roadmap to say to the state, even though we're not going to be together anymore, this is our plan for how we're going to continue to parent our children. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of people that aren't necessarily in agreement about how much time they're going to get to spend with their kids, those kind of issues. So we help with that a lot. We sit down and help people work out parenting plans. But besides family mediation, we do workplace mediation, often employee to employee. Supervisor will send a couple of employees over and say, I've done everything I can. They can't seem to resolve this. I want them to work it out in a different setting. And we sit down with those employees and facilitate a conversation that will help them resolve whatever's disrupting in the workplace. So workplace, we do business disputes, property disputes, landlord-tenant disputes. I know it sounds kind of ambitious to say this, but literally any kind of conflict, personal conflict between two people or between two parties, our model of mediation is appropriate for potentially help. So all the way from conflict with your next door neighbor to conflict in the process of divorce, conflict with somebody that you work with, conflict with your boss. This model of mediation can very often help people communicate on a different level and actually resolve issues.
Sounds pretty good. I want to bring Charlene into this because Charlene, if I'm not mistaken, you were working out a divorce. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So how did you think this process was successful for you?
It was in the sense that in the beginning, we had property, I had a restraining order and against him. So we had property that needed divided up inside the house, in the garage, outside. And I was trying to figure out what he wanted and what he didn't. I would take care of that. And it did, because we were able to, that made it easier for me to take care of the problem as far as getting rid of everything in the inside of the house, getting it painted, selling the property. And he was just going to take care of the inside of the garage.
So you were not able to sit down and let's work that out between you and him. You needed a third party, you felt?
Because I had a restraining order, and we at that time couldn't agree on anything.
Oh, okay. All right, so even with a restraining order, the two of you could sit down at a table?
He was unwilling, actually, but it happened. Our oldest daughter was able to be there to keep him from getting angry.
Oh, okay.
Resentful.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, sounds like this process works for people who are, very passive and people who might be more difficult, I guess. John, we've got to take a break here because we're already late into the program, but we have so many more questions to ask them about how this process might be able to work for you. If you've got a question, don't hesitate to call 547-8726. We're back in a moment. We're talking about dispute resolution today, and we have three folks in the studio with us. We have the director, we have an intake coordinator, and we have somebody who has been involved, who's actually resolved a case. I want to make sure that certain points get covered today. So, Rosemary, I want to talk with you very specifically because you do intake. And we are a community that is certainly has changing demographics, that's for sure. So, is your service bilingual?
Yes, our service is bilingual.
Can you please tell our listeners that who might find that helpful?
Los servicios de esta agencia tenemos la posibilidad de ayudar a las personas que prefieran hacer su multa en español.
All right, thank you, Rosemary. I really appreciate that. Going back to exactly what this service is, so it's mediation, it's not arbitration. So in mediation, people agree to the conditions themselves. They're not told what they are. But what if I don't like that? I mean, so when I go in, do I have to agree to accept whatever we come up with?
If it's your agreement, yes, but we do not tell them what the agreement's going to be. The difference between mediation and arbitration is obviously both the mediator and an arbitrator are neutral parties in this. In arbitration, though, the arbitrator has a different rule than a mediator. Arbitrator, and there's two kinds of arbitration, binding and non-binding. So the arbitrator is going to listen to both sides. And then if it's binding arbitration, the arbitrator is going to make a ruling and say this is what the agreement is going to be to resolve this. And if it's binding, then they've said ahead of time, we'll accept that, we'll sign on to it. Non-binding arbitration, the arbitrator does the same thing, but gives an opinion, gives an advisory opinion of, here's what, as I hear both sides, how I would resolve it, or here's what I hear. And often, non-binding arbitration is used as a step getting ready to go to litigation.
Mm-hmm.
So the arbitrator can help both sides understand the relative strengths and weaknesses of their case if they're headed for court. So the mediator doesn't do that at all. Our mediators, as I said, we practice facilitative, interest-based mediation. The mediators remain neutral. They certainly listen to both sides, but they're not the ones that are going to offer solutions. They're not the ones that are going to come up with an agreement. They're going to help these folks offer solutions back and forth that maybe they can negotiate about and then come to agreement themselves. And so when they come to agreement, the mediators will help them write that up, and all in the state of Washington, all agreements reached through mediation are binding under the RCW. So if it's their agreement and they're fine with it, they sign it. As soon as they sign it, if they take that back to court, the court's going to honor and back that up.
All right, so I can't participate in mediation and then 2 months later decide, yeah, I didn't really agree with that. I am bound to it once I sign it.
Yes, but if 2 months later you decide, I don't agree with this, there's two options. You can come back to mediation and renegotiate it and say, 2 months ago we thought this was going to work. Already we're seeing it's not. We need to sit down and talk about, what changes we need to make. And if they can modify their parenting plan. And if they're in agreement, once again, they sign it and they go on out. The other way to get a parenting plan modified is through the courts. And you request a hearing and you say, here is parenting plan we've been going by. Things have changed. These are the needs that we need, the things we need to change, and ask the judge to rule those changes.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's go back to Charlene. And during this process, you both agreed to show up. So was the process rocky, and how many sessions did you have?
We just had one session, and it went pretty smooth. They did set it up for us to have separate rooms, but they asked if they thought we could do it in one, and it was fine with me. And it was fine with him. And what it was is I spoke to the female And so we didn't talk to each other, didn't have to look at each other. I spoke directly to her, and then his gentleman would relay it to him, and then he would speak to him, and she would relay it back to me. So we didn't get any communication problems, which is what a lot of our problem was.
Oh, wow, okay, that seems very, very helpful.
Mhm.
So in the conclusion, were you both satisfied with what you came up with?
At the time being, yes.
Oh, so that's changed since then. Why? Implementation or what?
He kept changing his mind, backing out of it. We ended up going to court over it. It took 2 years, but the outcome was the exact same as what it started out to be.
Oh, okay.
So it didn't change in the effect of how it was set up in the resolution. It helped me because I was able to take care of business, which I needed to do, you know, sold the property so we could have some to relocate, sold the home so we could both have money to live on. The items I just put into storage, he finally decided he wanted some and I gave it to him. You know, there's no anger.
Mm-hmm.
It's just our lives have just gone downhill as far as other things.
Yeah. That happens to a lot of us, yes. Okay, so this is a very, very big job, it seems to me, for mediators. And as I understand it, they are not employees. These folks that do the mediation are actually volunteers. How do you prepare a volunteer for this big job?
It's pretty demanding. It is a big job, and it's really incredible, the volunteers that we have, because they take on a lot of responsibility. We put them through, at the very beginning, a 40-hour fundamentals of mediation training. And that's over a 5-day period, and we give them all the basic and fundamentals of how to mediate and of our mediation model, the interest-based facilitative model. And so following the completion of that, including a very comprehensive final exam that they have to hand in a few weeks after the class, following that, if they've done well, they can be invited into our intern program. And that's where they begin to implement the things that they've learned. And the way they do that is to first sit in on some actual mediations and observe, and then they move to the mediation table and they begin to mediate with an already certified co-mediator. And they do a series of that, 10 to 12 actual mediations with a senior co-mediator as part of their training. And at the conclusion of that, they meet with our certification committee. We go back over their entire training and so forth. And if all is well, we certify them as a certified mediator for the DRC. That means that they can mediate at any of the 20 centers across the state, because our training is standardized. And subsequent to that, we also have a 20-hour training that is specifically on divorce, parenting plans, family mediation.
Mm-hmm.
So we teach them some basics about Washington state law as it pertains to divorce and those kind of things, and then specifically how to mediate a parenting plan, how to mediate the division of property in a divorce, and those kind of things. And so if they take that, it's a total of 60 hours of classroom training plus an intern or practicum where they're actually doing the work. And then once they're certified, there is a requirement to maintain certification, and that is very minimal, but the minimum is that we ask them to mediate at least 4 times a year, roughly once a quarter, and also to accumulate continuing education credits, ongoing training. And we provide that. Once a month we have an in-service ongoing training for all of our volunteer mediators, but there's a variety of ways. They can go to training outside the DRC. There's a variety of ways that they can accumulate those continuing training credits.
So it sounds like you have a lot of information that would be useful in many different settings in a community. And I went to your website, I looked at some of the material on your website, and I saw that you do 2 other programs at the Juvenile Center, which has to do with conflict in you and also something about shoplifting, and those 2 really caught my eye. What do you do at the Juvenile Justice Center?
Well, it's in conjunction with juvenile justice, and we approached them several years ago and kind of talked about program that we could implement to help with conflict in the family, conflict between adolescents and parents and so forth. And we developed a parent-teen mediation program. We've not had very many people actually avail themselves of that.
Oh dear, okay.
I think
No, they
it's,
should.
a lot of people just aren't aware. But out of working with folks at Juvie on that, they came to us and said, we have some other needs maybe you can help us with. And so at this point, we do positive alternatives to stealing and shoplifting. And so
Wow,
that's...
I like that title.
Yeah, that's...
Huh.
And we have a young lady that is very, very good at this, that has taken our training and so forth, but this was really the area she wanted to work in, so she specialized in this. And once or twice a month, depending on how many they have at Juvie that they need to put through the program, they do this PASS class. That's the positive alternative to, So PASS class really focuses on, well, what are the root causes? Why do I do this? Why have I been stealing and shoplifting? And what are alternatives? And what can I do to change that behavior and so forth? The other class is called Conflict in Youth, and that is more focused on kids that are in conflict. A lot of time it's with family, but a lot of times it's also in school.
Mhm.
And the Juvenile Justice Department has folks have criteria that determines who gets channeled into that. I know for sure that first time assault, that I hauled off and punched somebody in the hall, I got in trouble. So they end up at Juvie, they go through this program. And again, it's Conflict in You, and we teach them some of the basics of understanding conflict, understanding their emotions, understanding alternative ways to express those emotions.
And to alleviate, who gets what or who needs what. The financial part was a little bit harder. Because
Okay, go ahead.
we had been married 32 years and
Mhm.
everything, and so we had to work on that part of it. So I had to get a lawyer, and it took a lot.
Okay, so mediation, Paul, what part does mediation do in a divorce if I still have to get a lawyer?
Okay.
All the work aspect gets resolved versus taking up $150 an hour or more, an attorney to do that with me?
Actually, in the state of Washington, there's a variety of ways to go about getting a divorce, all the way from doing it all yourself, which is very challenging, but it is possible to do, to having attorneys do all of it, and everything in between there. So it is possible, if people are willing to work together and don't have high conflict, for them to come to mediation and work out the terms of the divorce. If there's kids involved, a parenting plan, and they get those agreements, then none of that work has to be done in court. So it very much shortens the time and the cost. The other thing is that in our two counties, mediation is now a mandatory step in the process of getting a divorce. So anywhere where there is disagreement, the court is going to send them to mediation first, basically saying, we want you to work out as much of this on your own through mediation as possible. And when they come back, whatever hasn't been determined in mediation, of course, the courts and attorneys are involved with resolving that. So all the way from you can do this if you can come to an agreement on your own, and then just get help with the paperwork, to you can do this all with lawyers, but somewhere in there, there's going to be the expectation of the court that you at least try mediation to resolve as much of it as possible.
All right, well, we've learned about a service that's available here in the Tri-Cities, Dispute Resolution Center. Just Google it, people. You'll find a phone number and a way to learn more about it. I really appreciate all three of you coming in
Thank
and
you.
sharing information. We're back in a moment. Stay with us.